Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, August 6th, 1930, Crater goes missing. And Niki, this is a true crime podcast now.
It is. I'm really excited about it. We're finally going to make bank.
Yes, that's right. The sponsors are just going to come flying in. It's our first foray into true crime. And like all good true crime podcasts, we're going to talk about something for a while and then not actually tell you what happened because we don't know. But here is the case at hand. On the night of August 6th, Justice Joseph Force Crater, New York Supreme Court Justice, ate dinner with a group that included his girlfriend. He was married, but this group included his girlfriend. Then he left and was headed ostensibly to a Broadway show. But then he went missing. Some say they saw him at the show. Some say they didn't. Over the next couple weeks, it became clear that he had vanished and he stayed missing. We'll get into some of the twists and turns and conspiracy theories, but he was never found. Justice Crater was never found, and he was legally declared dead in 1939. The NYPD closed the Crater file in 1979. So let's talk about it, and I'm joined, as always, by Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody. I
think we both want to talk about this case itself. It's very interesting, a missing person case, but this is also kind of our chance because it's a powerful judge. It's New York in the 1930s. This is a chance to talk about Tammany Hall, the era of corruption, which is also where a lot of the vacuum for conspiracy theories comes in, and a little bit about like machine politics of that era. But we should talk about him first. I gotta say, my first reaction to this story, Joseph Force Crater, is just quite the name. It sounds like the name that someone who's named Joseph Frank Carter would like make up as their alternate superhero name, but his name is actually Joseph Force Crater.
I know. He was kind of written exactly for this kind of unsolved mystery. I'm not entirely sure that this could definitely have been a long con that started back when he was born in the 19th century.
Ooh, pushing it even further back into the conspiracy. All right, so what do we need to know about him? He was a truly powerful man up until the moment he went missing.
Yeah, I mean, he was a Supreme Court justice, and in this case, it wasn't the appellate court, but it was a trial court. And if you were going to get appointed to this court, you were somebody who had connections, because even though there had been all kinds of laws passed to sort of cut back on patronage, which is where when somebody wins an election, they give all their buddies jobs. In New York, thanks to Tammany Hall, this was something that still went on quite a lot. So you kind of had to have connections with powerful people in the state if you wanted to get appointed to a court like this. And powerful connections were something that Crater had a lot of.
Yeah. See, we're going to make the Crater Carter. We're going to flub that a few more times, listeners. Get ready. I've been doing it even when I've just been writing. And we should say Tammany Hall in this Tammany Hall era, obviously like an actual physical building, but also just it's a symbol for really, I would say, the most corrupt machine patronage politics we've had in this country, right?
Yeah, I mean, I keep tripping over Tammany Hall era because it was such a long time that Tammany Hall was a powerful force in New York politics. I mean, this is something that spanned the entire 19th century. It's most associated with Boss Tweed, sort of the last third of the 19th century. Somebody who both did a lot of things, especially for new immigrants arriving in New York City, but who also just stole a ton of money from the city as part of his many, many, many corruption scandals.
Yeah. Force Creator, Boss Tweet. They knew how to name people back then. So I do want to get into some of the machine politics and the good and bad related to that. But on this disappearance, so he has dinner. He's supposed to go to a show. He then disappears. One thing that's interesting is it takes a while for the world to recognize that he has disappeared. Remember, this is 1930. It's not like, oh, he didn't text his friends that night or whatever. Like it's like a week before his wife, who I think is in Maine at the time, sort of says, I haven't heard from my husband in a while. And then it's like another couple weeks before he doesn't show up at work. And slowly people start to piece together. We should just jump into it. Like, what, as far as you can tell, is the sort of best theory of case, or what are the important facts we need to know about how he went missing and why?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know exactly what's important because of all of the theories, dare I say conspiracy theories, that have popped up around his death. But we know that he had been vacationing with his wife in Maine. He gets a phone call. He says he has to go down to the city to straighten some things out. He goes down to the city. He seems to have potentially set aside some money and his will and some life insurance papers before he went out that night, which would be a big clue if we were certain that he actually did that. They were found quite a bit later by his wife after detectives had already gone through the house. Look, then we don't even know if he went to the play that night. We just know that at some point he disappears. And as you were pointing out, people don't really know when he went missing because, it's a while before anybody notices.
Yeah. One thing reading back on this story is just how obviously a powerful person goes missing. Americans like stories like that. It's like immediately a place for conspiracy theories, and they sprout from the weeks afterwards and then have continued. And there's been books written, and there's been all sorts of investigations, and through the years people have popped up and said they know what this man's fate was. So we don't have to go through all of them, but are there any that are most interesting to you? And I guess I should ask you whether you have started to come around to any of them as an explanation for what happened.
Look, the one that I am most drawn to, although I'm interested in a lot of them, is this idea that he had gone to a brothel, had a heart attack, and the madam of the brothel, Polly Adler, had ways of getting rid of the bodies of powerful men who expired on her watch. And we know that he had a taste for relationships outside of his marriage. That all just seems very believable to me. What about you?
I don't know. I mean, I know that the insurance papers thing is like a little sketchy because it was found so much later. But, I tend to, with these things, go for the like most pedestrian explanation. And I feel like insurance scam is often at the heart of it. Now, can't tell you exactly what the scam would be, disappear forever and ever and never pop back up. But maybe he did try and abscond and then he died, or I don't know. I mean, I will say it's funny, like you read some of these theories and you hear about 5 years later, there was a reported sighting in New York, and then 10 years later, people thought they saw him in another part of the country, and then someone reported seeing him like in Hawaii, and he just keeps popping up through the decades with all these different sightings.
Yeah, you got a little bit of the Bigfoot sighting thing going on here, where I think it helps us to understand how big this case was, because it's one of those things where I had never heard of it, and to know that it had become such a cultural phenomenon where people across America, people traveling across the world, were saying that they had spotted Crater suggests that he was at the forefront of a lot of people's minds during this era.
Yeah, I mean, sort of like B.D. Cooper also, the person who jumped out of an airplane, what was it, in the Northwest after robbing a bank and was never discovered. And then there's all this talk of them showing up throughout the years. So, I guess the question of the fascination around this gets a little to the larger world in which this story is couched, which is this world of Tammany Hall, this world of political corruption and power. Do you think that's part of it, that he was a symbol of something that was such a force in that era?
Yeah, I do actually think so. And I think it might be why people were so willing to spin out so many different theories about him, because they understood how corrupt Tammany Hall really was. So he had been appointed as a kind of reform candidate, like the anti-Tammany Hall judge, by FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, who was the governor of New York at the time. And yet he had all of these associations with people who were knee-deep in things like selling judgeships, and the mafia was sort of in control of Tammany Hall by this point in time. So I think that the idea that a powerful man could be taken out by other powerful men, which I think is behind a lot of the different conspiracy theories. I mean, it seems people were already suspicious enough of Tammany Hall to raise some questions.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the mob was involved at this point in Tammany Hall. Give us a sense of the level of graft and cronyism that ruled government at that time. And I guess in particular, what role does a powerful judge have in that system?
So a lot, right? Because a powerful judge can tip a case one way or the other. And you kind of have to have the legal system to some extent in your pocket if you're going to have a level of corruption of this size, because then either nobody will ever bring a case against you, or if they bring a case against you, the judge will find in your favor. And so it's really important to have people in police departments and in the prosecutor's office and in these judgeships in order to keep a very corrupt regime in place. And, Tammany Hall develops over, again, decades, if not more than a century. And the corruption is deeply embedded in it. It was the idea behind it that the corruption was how you got things done in an era before you had really well-functioning government. But, for at least 30, if not 50 years prior to this, there had been real fights in New York between the forces of Tammany Hall and corruption and machine politics and the good government people who wanted to clean things up. So there had at least been attempts to clean up Tammany Hall, even if they hadn't all worked.
And where do you sort of ultimately come down on this very complicated question of often the way in which machine politics can get things done, and especially, for a city that is growing, and, there is a way in which Tammany Hall really just pushed New York forward in sort of very concrete ways, but obviously full of graft and corruption. So how should we think back on that? And it's not irrelevant to now either. I mean, there's people who make the case for lobbying as a really important part of Washington, D.C. That's how people get things done. And backroom deals can sometimes be good because it's just about people making decisions together. So, kind of where do you come down on all of this?
Yeah, there's an article a couple of years ago called something like The Case for Corruption. And it was exactly this idea that the corruption is what gets things done. Money in government makes the wheels turn. Tammany Hall, especially for a city that was in the midst of a wave of mass migration, where there weren't social services to help the poor, and tons of people in New York City lived in poverty. There weren't services to help new immigrants. Tammany Hall helped people find jobs. They've helped people find apartments. At the same time, they expected something in return. They expected your vote, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of your votes in a given year. So it corrupts the political process in that way. But also, maybe your apartment was with a slumlord, right? Maybe your job then required you to be corrupt on your job as a firefighter or a police officer. So it does some good things for society, but it also spreads expectations of corruption as well.
Okay, well, let's start to wrap up and just come back a little bit to our missing judge for a second. So, one interesting thing is his story, obviously, as we've discussed, becomes a sensation, but it also becomes a shorthand. And I think this is of a generation or two before us, but pulling a crater was apparently a reference that people would get as just basically disappearing. And you see there's examples of it showing up in TV and in writing and so forth. So he really did enter the mainstream culture in that way.
Yeah, this was a huge surprise to me because this wasn't something that people got on the grocery store sound system in order to say, Judge Crater, call your office or anything like that.
Judge Crater, call your office is the phrase, right? Yes, people were, yeah.
Yeah, which it requires so much embedded knowledge of what actually happened. Right. So the idea that this was that kind of widespread cultural phenomenon is really interesting. Why is it that some cases just stick in people's minds? But
then also, the fact that you don't get the reference. I mean, look, Niki, you're going to post a crying Jordan meme 20 years from now, and no one's going to get it. But, everyone would get it now. It's just, this is what happens.
No, it's the
people
passage
forget
of time.
References.
Yes,
yeah,
although
exactly.
It did appear in The Sopranos. So there's somebody carrying the crater torch out there in popular culture. But yeah, I mean, it also was of its moment. But the reason that I make that comparison, Jody, is because there was another big national case that was the obsession of everyone just a few years later, and that was the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. So that has stuck with us, I think, a little bit more than the crater thing has. But it speaks to how closely people were following these true crime cases.
Though I feel like my cultural reference to the Lindbergh baby, and it's just hanging on by a thread that I get that reference, is that The Simpsons had an episode in which Grandpa Simpsons claimed to have been the missing Lindbergh baby. And that was just enough of an overlap with my growing up that now, I make the connection. And yes, unfortunately, Judge Crater didn't get that kind of reference, and a lot of people have sort of forgotten it.
Being a Simpsons connoisseur is the best way to stay up to date on popular culture from the 1930s.
That's true, exactly. All right, that brings us to the end of the episode. Send us your conspiracy theories, I guess, if anyone knows. Maybe we can break this case. That will really vault us to the top of the true crime charts if we can break this decades-old case.
That's right. If we can solve this one, thanks to our listeners, that'll put us at the top of the charts.
All right, well, you can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. Nicole Hammer, thank you, as always.
Thanks, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. One new thing I want to tell you about, we've been working on trying to get this going for a bit, but we are now doing transcripts of the show. So you can find a link in the show notes or on our website. And thanks to Kaula Nakua for helping with those, but those will be up probably by midday, the day the show comes out. And a number of people have asked about transcripts, and it's the good thing to do. So you can find a link now at thisdaypod.com. You can follow us on social media where we're posting a bunch of stuff each and every day on Twitter and Instagram at thisdaypod. Once again, email us thisdaypod@gmail.com with ideas and questions about the show. Coming up next, our weekend election special. We'll be back on Sunday with a conversation about Martin Van Buren, a new third party, and how third parties get formed and fall away in this country. My name is Jody Evergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.